I'm Greg Hunter. Welcome to USAWatchdog.com. We have a brand new guest. He started his blog back in 2005. He is an author, written 15 books. He writes a lot on his blog, of2minds.com. If you haven't guessed, Charles Hugh Smith, that's who's up. Charles Hugh Smith, thank you for joining us today on USAWatchdog.com.
It's my pleasure, Greg.
Well, I've been a big fan of your site since my CNN days back in 2006, which, there's so much talent out there that the Internet has uncovered that would never be uncovered in the past because, they had to pick you to be a star. And, now you can just be a star on your own ability, which you are. Your site, you have a big site on the web, very successful. And I want to just touch on something that I read on your site, which is kind of what I do on USA Watchdog, and that is that you are trying to make sense of trends unfolding, which I think is I think the financial story and then it's going to be the political story, which go hand in hand, is huge. The trend unfolding right now is this crazyville in Greece, which, they've gotten these ultimatums. Just so you know, this is just this last week in the USA Today. And I don't see how the ultimatum holds water. I mean, they voted to say, yeah, no. So, the bond fraud is unbelievable. They didn't get very much of the money. What do you think about this trend in Europe with, it's not just Greece, but it's all the other indebted countries? Give us your take and give us some of your take on the unfolding trend that you see.
Okay, Greg. I think we can start with a trend that's visible in the U.S., in China, in Japan, and in Europe as well. And the trend is the authorities are going to further and further extremes under the surface to maintain the illusion of surface stability. And so in Europe, the problem with Europe is that the euro was doomed from the start. And I'm not saying this as the only person who thought of this. Many people said the problem is when you have one currency and very different kinds of economies, say Greece and Germany, then there's no way to correct the imbalance between those two in terms of trade deficits, productivity, except debt. And so that's why the pig countries all have tremendous debt, is there was no other way to for them to cover the trade imbalances. They all run trade deficits. Germany and the Netherlands run huge trade surpluses. And in a normal economy, when your imports and exports are out of balance, your currency depreciates, right? And then the stuff you're importing gets more expensive. You buy less of it. Your stuff gets cheaper to everyone else. Your exports rise, and so you get a rebalancing through market mechanisms. What's really happened in Europe is the market mechanisms were taken away by the Eurozone and the euro. And so now they're trying to rebalance, but they don't have any tools except central planning.
Isn't this going to blow sky high? I mean, isn't Greece a dead canary in a EU coal mine with a lot of other dead canaries that they're stuffing and propping up on a bar, i.e. Spain and Italy, and even France has got huge banking trouble. Isn't this going to blow sky high?
Absolutely, Greg. And we can look at the Lehman moment in the U.S. in 2008 for what the European authorities are terrified of, namely that the enormous extremes of leverage and risk suddenly become apparent to everybody, and then the selling starts. And so the problem in Europe was the Greek debt was all created by the German and French banks. So if they'd let Greece go down in 2010 like they should have, then who would have gone down was the German and French banks. So a Lehman moment in Europe. So what the European authorities did instead was they transferred all that debt, which is never going to be paid, to the taxpayers of the European Union. So they're the ones who are going to be stiffed as Greece defaults.
Or they could just march on their bankers and their leaders and say, hey, we're tearing this paper up. I mean, because that's who's benefiting. The rich, one of my themes is the rich just don't want to take a hit. They do not want to take a hit. And they should have taken a hit.
That's right. And Greg, that's an excellent point, because if Greece had defaulted when it should have 5 years ago and exited the euro 5 years ago when all these problems were apparent, the debt that would have been defaulted was on the order of, I think, $110 billion. Still a lot of money.
Not 350 billion.
Yeah. And so the damage has been tripled and nothing's been solved because the system was doomed from the start.
I want to talk about one of your latest articles on your website, which I think is brilliant, and that is Trouble a Brewin', and this time it's different. You're taking it off the the famous economist. This time it's different. And it's never different, but this time is different. Here's the chart you used. It's from the government, and I want people to focus in. They can see this on your website of 29s.com, which I'm going to link to. This down here is, to me, with their zero interest rate, flatlining. And then we have this little paltry bottom-bouncing growth, John Williams of ShadowTats.com. That's what it looks like to me as well. But we have these 0% interest rates and not much growth, and there's only one place interest rates can go after they hit zero, right? I mean, what's your point with this chart?
Well, Greg, I think the chart shows if you go back 40 years, which is 2 generations, right, back to 1975, which is where this chart shows, you'll see that interest rates have been falling for 30 years, and now there's no place left for them to go. And this time it is different, because never before in modern American history have rates and yields on Treasury bonds been zero for so long. In fact, they've never been at zero at all, and now it's been 6+ years. And so, meanwhile, you'd think this was supposed to solve everything. Well, according to the Fed's own measure of financial health, if you will, that's going in the wrong direction. And when when that index goes up, it's indicative of recession and stock market declines.
What you're saying is that what are we going to do? We're going to hold interest rates forever, and then we'll just be in a recession at 0% interest rates? Or is the bond market finally going to function correctly and say, whoa, we need way more money for the risk we're getting because all those European bonds have just defaulted?
Absolutely, Greg. That's right. Interest rates should rise. And what we're seeing is financial repression, which a lot of your other guests have described, so we won't get into that. That instead of letting the market decide what the price of risk should be, central banks have pushed it to zero. And in Europe, it's negative rates, right? And so how much lower can you get below zero? Well, you can go negative, but it doesn't seem to be working. It's not fixing what's broken. And that's the unfolding trend. All these things the central banks and authorities are doing, they're not really fixing what's broken. They're actually creating more problems.
Well, some people want a fix on this. And, what I have come to the conclusion, and please tell me of your conclusions, and I think you think there's great opportunity in change, but the change is going to be ugly. And especially for the unprepared. And I think you can't change until this thing blows. What say you?
I have to agree, simply because there's so many vested interests in keeping the illusion of stability. In other words, you've got the banks, you've got the politicians who will be at risk of being voted out if the thing comes apart. And there's a lot of pension funds and other players who are hoping and praying that the thing does stabilize, because they're on the hook for huge losses if interest rates rise or the stock market declines.
But it's baked into the cake, is it not? It's going to blow.
Right, because the trend we're really describing here again, Greg, is the extremes of policy that are being done to maintain the surface illusion of stability are guaranteeing that it's going to blow. Because once you have extremes, then the risk and volatility eventually rise and explode. That's just the way systems work. That's what history shows us.
Well, last week I don't mean to laugh, but last week the FBI said we'll be all over that flash crash. We're gonna lend our really. You're gonna tell us if there's a fraud involved. The FBI, the FBI, the Justice Department, that hasn't jailed or charged a single top banker. J.P. Morgan helped Bernie Madoff in his huge fraud, and they paid a fine. They laundered money for drug cartels and for countries on the terror list. What? And the FBI so our fraudulent leaders and our fraudulent bankers are okay as long as it's our fraud. But if it's somebody else wrecking our little fraudulent game, whoa, we're going to be all over that. Is that a fair appraisal of what's going on? The extremes is what you're talking about?
Unfortunately, that's exactly what's happened. And so one of the other trends that's unfolding, Greg, as a result of this, people are losing faith in the system, and they're feeling they may not be able to put their finger on it, but they're feeling a rise in financial insecurity. Even people that work for the state and local government, their pensions seem rock solid. Even they're worried. Even they understand that they may not get their full pension because when the thing falls apart, all guarantees are off the table and the rules will change.
I pity people who have any kind of a state or federal pension. I mean, or any pension, really, frankly. I mean, isn't all that stuff just going to go poof?
Yeah, it's hard to know what's going to happen, Greg, but we can look at history. Like recently, it's like Cyprus before, bail-ins where the banks and the government will take whatever money you have in the bank to save the bank. In other words, it's not really your money, it's the bank's money. And the idea that it's your money is another surface illusion. And tax rates can go up. As Gordon Long and I discussed, he's a recent guest of yours. The tax rate on Social Security kicks in at some really low amount, like $35,000-$40,000. So, they can easily start taxing your pension and taxing it higher and higher until you get 50% of it. And we all know inflation's much higher than stated, at least in healthcare, higher education, all the big ticket items. So maybe they'll just keep the pension frozen and eat away at it through inflation. And all these things history says all these things are in the tool bag of authorities.
They could just say, hey, forget it, we can't pay. I mean, that's what's going to happen in Greece. And, I have a lot of friends when I talk to them about, very few of them knew about Cyprus. I mean, I have friends on the internet, I have friends that I talk to and people, acquaintances. They don't know, hey, what? Huh? Cyprus and now Greece. And, it's the same thing that happened. And people say, what's going to happen? I said, watch Cyprus. So now we have Greece. And probably in short order, I think at least Spain and Italy and Portugal are going to hit the rocks, you think?
Yeah, and let's look at those numbers real briefly, Greg. I think Spain's debt is €1 trillion, Italy over $1 trillion. I mean, we're talking fairly serious money here. Trillion here, trillion there, pretty soon you're talking serious money. So, I compare it to a household. Partly, Greg. In other words, this gets abstract, when we're talking about trillions and all that. But if you, say, lose your job and you can't cover your mortgage, the best thing to do is take the pain, take the hit, totally adjust your life, your goals, your workload, and get through it. Right? Start over, reset. Well, that's what they're not allowing the system to do. Right? That's why the pain in Greece just keeps going on and on. Whereas if they'd defaulted, exited the euro, and reset, taken the hit, they'd already be on the road to recovery now.
Yeah.
Well, that's the tragedy. The more you try to hold up a rotten, corrupt, failed, unsustainable system, you're just creating more pain and lengthening the pain.
I don't want to get too deep into the woods, but I mean, Germany's got to be terrified about Deutsche Bank, and I keep bringing this up because it's just astounding that a bank that has, 73, 75, something like that, $1 trillion in derivatives. I mean, it's 20 times the German economy. Angela Merkel she knows that's going on. She absolutely. And how do you unwind something that big without crashing Germany and everybody else in the world? I mean, isn't that what's coming? A world. I mean, the big picture here is that people in America think that's that Europe is like Las Vegas, and what happens in Europe stays in Europe. But that's coming here, is it not? It's going to go around the globe, is it not?
Absolutely, Greg, because when you look at the Deutsche Bank derivatives you're mentioning, of course they're tied into a bunch of other financial institutions in tremendously complex ties, that it takes months to figure out when the thing finally collapses. Look how long it took to unravel all the Lehman Brothers trades.
A couple of years.
Yeah, and I think you're very prescient in discussing Deutsche Bank because that's really why Germany's had to save, and that's in quotes, Greece. Because if Greece had defaulted on all that debt from Deutsche Bank would be gone already. So it's like the extremes are why are they going to such extremes? To save the banks. and the damage being done by an attempt to save an insolvent institution.
So what you read on the frequency, it just seems to me every day I hear something more crazy and something more outrageous, and this is what all the spying's about. This is, I mean, they were spying, our government was spying on Merkel, and now we find out Hollande and all these leaders in France and Germany and everybody in Brazil, everybody's being spied on by our leaders. And is it because, do you think that, and let me get to this, do you think that the frequency, the drumbeat is picking up and that we could get an event sooner than later, maybe as early as this fall? A lot of people think this fall you start seeing the wheels start, going off in front of the pickup truck.
Yeah, and I see the motivation and the trend unfolding along those lines. Now, they may be able to save it for another quarter. Maybe it'll be, the first quarter of 2016. We don't know the exact timing, but they just keep winding the spring tighter and tighter in an attempt to control the exact circumstance that they're all afraid of, which is the wheels falling off, right? So all the spying, all the manipulation, the propaganda, the plunge protection team, it's all about trying to control events, right? And so when things spin out of control, then they've already used all the tools they have to try to control the thing. And so, yeah.
That's what the Bank of International Settlements came out and said, which I thought was stunning. And everybody just went, none of the business channels, which I watch a lot of, none of the news channels. I mean, whoa, wait a minute. The Central Bank of Central Bankers came out and said, in the next crash, we're done. You can't be helped. I mean, that's exactly what they said, but that's what they said. Do you think that they're warning because it's closer than farther away, that maybe it's this fall? I mean, what's your timeline? What would you, if you were going to hazard a guess, and this is only a guess, what would you guess that if we're definitely going to have a crash? What's your timeline?
I think there's definitely going to be some sort of event, and we're starting to see it now. And maybe they'll stretch it out into September, October, which, as we all know, historically is when crashes tend to occur. And then they might unleash some sort of save, QE 4, 5, 6, whatever. They may pull some thing out of the hat, and then that would kind of cover things up again for another few months. But I think definitely by 2016, there's going to be events that they're unable to control. And we start seeing it, Greg, in the market action today. It's really unhealthy when the Dow is up 250, then it's down 250, then it's up 200, then it's down 200. I mean, these wild swings, they're reminiscent of 1929. And anybody that doesn't see that is missing the boat. That when the markets are swinging wildly, bull, bear, 1-2% swings all the time, and this is not just in the U.S., it's also, China and other markets. This is an indication that the wheels are coming off, because this is not a sign of a healthy market.
You are in California, correct?
Yes.
You got to be worried about that drought out there. I mean, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And the Dust Bowl days were in the 30s, and man, you look at a rain map on California, and just in out west in general, but California is ground zero of zero water. And how are you coping with that out there?
Yeah, well, Greg, that the key point of the drought here is actually because California grows so much food and ships it to the rest of the United States and the world. Actually, like 80% of our water is agricultural use, and 80% of that is exported. So actually, we're exporting our water in the form of vegetables and fruit and almonds. And so if you try to cut back on that, then you lose your exports, and people around the world have less lettuce, almonds, and all the other stuff grown here. So it's something to watch. If we don't get rain in the next year, it's going to be extremely problematic.
How are you protecting your friends and family? I mean, what do you tell people to do? I mean, you painted this terrible picture, and there's something people can do. I mean, do they just buy physical food and water and tires for their cars, batteries, and just get themselves completely set as best they can?
Yeah, I think, well, Greg, my advice kind of goes along two paths. One is if you can start growing your own food, and I know that's not going to happen in December in North Dakota, but I mean when the weather's good, and if you have a little plot of land or start growing your own food and cut back on things. Like, in other words, if you don't need so much fuel every month, that leaves you less vulnerable to a spike in gasoline prices or whatever. And if you cut your expenses, then you're reducing your vulnerability to a layoff or a cut in your hours, that kind of thing.
Cut back now and don't wait for it to be forced on you later.
That's right.
Good advice. Really good advice. And what about gold and silver? I know you're not really a gold and silver guy, but just your thoughts, being as I got you here.
Actually, I've often been accused of being a gold bug. As anybody who's in favor of assets that can't be depreciated by the government at will. That's the thing. You want to own assets that the government can't depreciate overnight, and gold and silver fall into that category. And so does income property. So does tools that you use to make a living with. In other words, the government can depreciate its own currency at will. So you want to own some assets that the government can't either take, like from a bail-in, or just depreciate, and by inflation or by fiat, by announcing it. Guess what? The currency's now worth 50% less.
That would mean gold and your tools are worth 50% more.
Yeah, and so gold and silver are definitely part of the spectrum of what we might call like material or tangible assets, and those are the kinds of things you want to own.
And finally, just to end on a positive note, you say that this change could be an opportunity, and that's what you say. You fall to the camp that it could be an opportunity, especially for people who are prepared. And obviously, you seem to be on with it, and you are with it, and you write about it and are prepared. Briefly, the opportunity you speak of.
Well, Greg, I think we can look at innovation as a threat. And it is a threat to the vested interests, the monopolies and the cartels and the politicians and all those guys who are making a killing on the system as it is now. But we can also look at innovation that in the terms of creative destruction, that it's going to tear down monopolies and cartels and vested interests. But the whole of society is going to benefit from innovation. And we're not just talking about innovation in mobile phones and so on. We're talking about innovations in government, in healthcare, in national defense. I mean, the really big ticket items in our society and economy. They're all vulnerable to innovation, and we should welcome that.
I'll tell you one innovation I wish we'd get back to, and that's the Constitution as it was written. And we could follow that because it's worked so well. I mean, we got a black president out of that. I mean, we have civil rights. We have, we had a format for the country to change. I mean, it wasn't easy. And we're not perfect, but the Constitution allowed positive change. Anyway, I don't think the change right now is so positive, especially for the unprepared. But Charles Hugh Smith, thank you for joining us today on USA Watchdog, your popular website of twominds.com. That's more innovation you were talking about. You get 400,000 or 500,000 people a month reading your work, and that's fantastic. Appreciate it. Charles Hugh Smith of twominds.com. Thank you very much for joining us today on usawatchdog.com.
Thank you very much, Greg.